We now welcome Helga Satzinger, who comes to us from history.
Race is popping up sometimes rather unexpectedly, sometimes even with a sort of big bang, as it just did last week in the Daily Mail and at UCL. Two women scientists explained the latest theories on the origin of our universe and gravitation on Newsnight. The UCL lecturer in cosmology, Hiranya Peiris, and the physicist, mechanical engineer and BBC presenter Maggie Aderin-Pocock. For some, this was a problem. The Daily Mail published an article which claimed that the two women were invited just because Newsnight editor was, quote, keen on diversity. Our Vice Provost for Research, David Price, defended in an open letter the academic qualification of the two women scientists. He criticized the Daily Mail for, quote, drawing attention to the gender and race of scientific experts, suggesting that non-white, non-male scientists are somehow incapable of speaking on the basis of their qualifications and expertise. End of quote. In the short communication on UCL Staff News, 3 terms were used to indicate the characteristics which gave the possibility for racial discrimination. Price used race and birthplace. Hiranya Peiris and Maggie Aderin-Pocock used skin color. The two women didn't use the term race, which I find significant. And I come to the question we have discussed already. Can we use the term race when we want to talk about racial discrimination and its long, painful history? Do we, by the use of the term race in the context of anti-discrimination activities, stabilize the belief that there are races out there, that humans can be grouped into this biological category? The online Oxford Dictionary counts race under the top 1,000 frequently used words, meaning besides race as competition and ginger root, etc. So the main meaning, each of the major divisions of humankind having distinct physical characteristics. But who identifies the distinct physical characteristics and how? Who decides which physical characteristics to use? Is it everyday perception of differences in skin color, type of hair, the shape of eyes and noses? Is it everyday perception linking those physical features to social and economic difference, to different habits and ways of life, linking them to histories of prejudice, suffering, domination, to centuries-old ingrained social and symbolic ways of creating hierarchies between humans by declaring them different by nature? Or do the sciences like anthropology, zoology, genetics, evolutionary theory, etc., tell us the distinct physical characteristics allowing the categorization into races? We know from history that there is no objective scientific knowledge with regards to race. It is always a matter of decision which traits are chosen to identify different groups, and usually no clear distinction can be found between those groups. Historians of science stress the historical changes in the meanings of race. They investigate the ways how race came into being, how it was contested and changed, and how the sciences contributed to the creation and stabilization of injustice, how they legitimized unequal social order, even leading to war, extermination politics, and genocide. But there were also phases of critique, like the one shortly after 1945, when anthropologists and geneticists challenged race as a scientifically legitimate category. And things have changed in the meantime. With the help of recent technologies of identifying genes, race is back on the scientific and medical agenda. And I think Sarah Gibbon will tell us more about this later. When I was appointed at UCL some years ago, I was asked to fill in a form declaring my racial identity. Coming from Germany and having worked on the history of genetics, gender, and racism in 20th century Germany, I found it rather strange to put myself somewhere into a racial category, white with the subgroups British, Irish, or other. So I thought, Bavarian, flat-footed, or what do they want to know? Biologically, these categories didn't make sense at all. Well, I did understand that this form was part of an effort to check if UCL appointments were systematically biased against certain people coming from the wide range of the old British Empire and other areas called, so nicely here, rest of the world. But why race? Does the alertness against racism imply that there are races? So my first reaction facing the form was, heavens, where do they think can I look up my racial identity? So if the question regarding my race had been asked some decades back, I would have had the following option. I could have had a look into a highly popular book sold in the hundreds of thousands in the 1920s, The Races of Europe, by Hans Friedrich Karl Günther, the most prominent popularizer of racial thought in pre-Nazi Germany and ardent racist and dominant during Nazi time. He was the popularizer, and Fischer and Verschuur, whom we heard about, were the more scientific branch of this enterprise. Günther published this book and similar ones on the races of the Germans or on the Jews to educate people to see races in their neighbors, to see particular types, which people not necessarily did until he showed them. Sorry. And please don't think that these books are a thing of the past. You find them on the internet, online, with annotations praising them as telling the truth about European history. Günther developed a couple of racial categories, and I'll show you some of his illustrations. Here you have the Nordic, the leading one. You see some Scots and some Germans here. We have the Ostish, Easterners, including people from France, it's a bit in the west, but doesn't matter, like the other Balzac, people from the Black Forest, from Tyrol in Austria, and from Berlin. And then he has the so-called Dinarisch, including the notable composers Weber, Liszt, and Bruckner. And please note their rather big noses, which made them similar to the Jews. With the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn on the top. He was the grandfather of the composers Felix and Fanny, and whose music was subsequently banned in Nazi Germany. The distribution of these groups were depicted in maps like this one, the racial map of Germany. It was published in 1934, the second year of Nazi rule. It shows the distribution of the Güntherian German races, and note, please note, that the Jewish people are missing on this map. The map precedes the politics of extermination by 8 years. Faced with the racist and anti-Semitic developments in Germany after 1933, the British zoologist Julian Huxley and the ethnologist Haddon published their book, We Europeans, A Survey of Racial Problems, so which included a lot of issues of race in Britain with the colonies, but also a response. It was also a response to the developments in Germany. And they challenged the approach to identify racial types as Fischer and Goethe did. And they challenged these types, which could be spotted easily by everyone on the street. Said, oh, you're just mistaken if you then think Norwegians are always blonde, etc. They challenged the hierarchization of races and called it pseudoscientific. They questioned that race was a useful category, and they developed a new population genetics-based concept of the genetic difference of certain populations. And this concept became part of the discussions in the UNESCO's post-45 campaign against racism. The key points of the post-45 concept of population genetics were: there are no races, there are only different populations who are geographically identified or characterized by common family ties, and a difference in the prevalence of certain genes, like immigrant religious groups in the United States, the Mormons, the Amish, the Ashkenazi, etc., who practice endogamy. 19th century and Nazi racism had claimed that nature created culture, that racial identity defines the social standing of people and determines history. The post-45 population genetics critique of racism postulated that human nature was the product of social practices. Different human populations with their specific gene pool were now a fluid product of human history, of migration and marriage practices, and effects of the environment. The reformulation of the biological race into a historically made population after 45 is my starting point for further research into some geneticists' pursuit of an anti-racist agenda. So I'm interested in this conflict, creating hereditary traits, but nevertheless criticizing racism. How did they interweave history and biology? How did they define racism? And what were the problems of racism they couldn't solve? One special point to consider is the issue of marriage bans. As these bans draw the line between different groups of people, they are central in all racist policies, like the ones in the US, in the tradition of slavery, apartheid in South Africa, or the anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany. Back to the problem of race, the last sentences. I don't have a solution. I think we need a new scientific language for embodied differences, or as Anne Fausto-Sterling called it, for embodiment as a dynamic system of biocultural formation. So that's the question on the body. But my question is, could we, analog to gender studies, try to get rid of the natural category race, avoid essentialism, and focus our attention on the function of racial difference as an allocator of social position, of power, authority, responsibility, or subordination? Can we be alert against racism, but avoid the biological category race? It will be a long way to go, I think, to become colorblind, but remain very conscious of any social discrimination.